We're going to start our afternoon session with a few comments from Paul Ulrich with Jonah Energy. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair, thank you, opportunity to maybe break up your meeting just a little bit, give you a very brief overview of what's going on in the Jonah field and what's going on in the energy market and some of the synergies between what we're doing and what our permittees are doing and all that other fun stuff. So I will try to be very brief. I did bring some show and tell. Senator Larson, I just handed a core sample from the Jonah field. Just to get you an idea, I'd love to get you out in the field. However, next best thing is perhaps just a bit of rock where we actually produce some of the nation's and perhaps the world's cleanest natural gas from. That's a core sample from roughly 13,700 feet right in the heart of the Jonah field. So pass that around, take a look, and we'll go from there. Good morning and welcome, obviously, to Sublette County. I'm Paul Ulrich, Vice President of Jonah Energy, and immensely proud to be part of a team at Jonah Energy that provides clean, sustainable energy development while balancing the needs for environmental protections. A little bit of history about the Jonah field. Throughout the life of the Jonah field, we've produced almost 60 billion barrels of oil and 6 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That's enough natural gas to satisfy Wyoming's consumption for over 40 years. And Jonah Energy alone has produced roughly 1.8 trillion cubic feet, enough to power Wyoming as a whole for over 15 years. The economic impact of the Jonah field has been a foundation of Wyoming since the late 1990s, when my dear departed friend Mickey McMurray first explored and discovered and made economic what we now know as the Jonah field. Examples clearly include our University of Wyoming football team playing on Jonah field, the formation of Wyoming's leading charitable organization, the McMurray Foundation, the $1.2 billion Jonah Energy has paid in federal and state royalties and taxes, and our charitable contributions close to $1 million. As early as the 1970s, Jonah just believed that natural gas was economically viable in the Upper Green. As I mentioned, it wasn't until the 1990s through McMurray that the first economic well was drilled in what we now call the Jonah field. That well, the Jonah Federal 1-5, proved to be the catalyst for one of the largest natural gas discoveries in the United States. What's remarkable, and this still strikes me to this day every time I'm out in the field, about the Jonah field is the footprint. The footprint is roughly 30,000 acres, 47 square miles. Put in that perspective, smaller than Fort Collins and about 2/3 the size of our nation's capital, in comparison to the Marcellus play, which covers some 104,000 square miles. So we've got a tremendous natural gas resource for the state of Wyoming in an area that is more than manageable, and that allows us to do things differently. To date, Jonah Energy, we've drilled over 500 wells. We manage another 2,500 wells, and have invested approximately $2 billion in capital and expect to invest roughly another probably $600 to $700 million over the next few years to recover what we think is kind of remarkable for Jonah, and that's another 1.8 to 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. If you would have asked me 15 years ago the life of the Jonah field, I would have said at the time, geologically speaking, that we had maybe 5 or 6 years left. The amazing thing about this industry, and in particular in Wyoming, is we're able to innovate out of our way of some really challenging market conditions. And Jonah has been an example time and time again of doing that. A field that was first vertically drilled, we migrated to directional drilling, and now we're horizontal drilling, which allows us to recover much more than we were in the past with a much less surface imprint. It's pretty neat being part of it. And what I really like is the fact we're not done innovating, and that's good for all of Wyoming. So fun fact about Jonah Energy, currently we're producing about 623 trillion equivalent BTUs a day. That's enough to power about 3.1 million Teslas, 15.5 billion iPhones, or Switzerland. So when it comes to operating here in the United States, emissions certainly is something that we've taken a hard look at for a long time in the field. And through cooperation and obviously partnerships with our state agencies, in particular DEQ, I can tell you that Wyoming and the Upper Green has probably got some of the cleanest gas per molecule anywhere in the country and probably the world. And we've done that between our partnership with DEQ and our voluntary actions for one reason, staying ahead of the market. The cleaner we can provide natural gas, the better off we're all going to be. Why we take those steps matters. So, between what we're doing on federal lands in Wyoming, natural gas fired rigs, our leak detection program, on and on. What you see between Jonah and Pure West is what we believe is going to be highly, highly marketable, clean natural gas for years, if not generations to come. So avoid and minimize. Obviously, we've got sage grouse issues we deal with. We've been able to tackle that through our work through the CIGIT and through our state partnerships. Freshwater consumption is kind of a big deal too. Very proud to admit that we no longer source fresh water for our drilling. We use our produced recycled water through a recycle and reuse program. So our completions activity is 100% with recycled water. We use fresh water, obviously, for our partnership with our permittees and for drilling surface. And that's it. And that's been a pretty big innovation too. So all in all, I am pleased to report and thankful you're here in Sublette County, my home county, with our fine Speaker of the House here, that Jonah Field has a long life ahead of us. We are ready, willing, and able to continue to invest in Wyoming, both through capital and innovation. But as you all know, we're not without challenges either. Clearly a national, if not international, effort to displace fossil fuels. Kind of a bummer if you're a fossil fuel producer. So we're pushing back on that. Obviously, federal permitting changes, challenges, and delays. That's certainly an issue you're going to be dealing with tomorrow, Madam Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, and I will be here for that as well. When I talk about serious threats to Wyoming's way of life, our federal permitting challenges through RMPs to APDs to right-of-ways to large-scale EISs to sage grouse amendments are a very real and direct threat to what we're doing here in the state. Leasing litigation is something we cannot ignore as a state either, from a legislative perspective, certainly as an agency perspective, and our perspective at Jonah Energy. I want to give you an example. There are 2 million acres of leased oil and gas mineral resources in this state that are off the table because of current ongoing litigation. Sage grouse management, I spoke briefly about that. I know we're going to get into that a little bit tomorrow, but the more effort we can in pushing back on our federal partners when it comes to allowing us to manage the bird as we see fit in a program through the CIGIT that has worked is important. And then finally, utility cost increases. I know that's not the direct purview of this committee per se, but it certainly has an impact on every single one of us in the state with what we're facing through Rocky Mountain Power with an upwards to a 30% increase in rates. I don't have an option of passing that on to customers. Ag producers don't have an option of passing that on to customers, and it needs to be addressed. So in closing, Madam Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, look forward to working with you. Thank you for being here. Let me have a few minutes to give you an update on that little field just south of us. I'd stand for questions.
Questions from the committee, Mr. Ulrich, Senator.
Real quick, do you have any insight? This is a pretty big question, but do you have any insight into what the prices over the next 5-10 years, the trend will be for gas? Because that impacts the state big time. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair. We certainly have our forecasts, and our forecasts do show fairly stable prices at an economic rate. However, Senator, I will tell you, with what we've seen the last 2 years, it's really hard to say. I can tell you this, between what we're doing in the Jonah Field and what Pure West is doing on differentiated natural gas, we have inked some deals because of how clean our natural gas is produced, that I think puts us in a better position than others. So, you know, when over half of Wyoming's natural gas exported comes from this county, it's important that we do it right, and our customers on the West Coast understand it and continue to use us.
Anybody else? Thank you for being here today. Thank you. Thank you for what you and the company do for the people of Wyoming and for the state itself. So thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair, thanks for the time. I appreciate it. Enjoy Sublette County.
Our next topic is going to be DEQ update and some proposed statutory changes. I believe we're going to go through a memo first with LSO, and then we'll move into the discussion with the administrator.
Chairman Craigo, members of the committee, Pierre Chenet with LSO. At the June meeting, the committee requested additional information on whether other states allow on-site burial of animal mortality waste, and LSO provided the committee with a memo that I'll briefly present. The memorandum surveys whether meat processors may bury processing waste on-site in 8 states: Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Utah. In Idaho, the State Department of Environmental Quality does not allow meat processing plants to dispose of waste on-site because the department considers meat processing plants to be commercial entities which must dispose of waste at approved solid waste management facilities. In North Dakota, the State Department of Environmental Quality does not include burying as a recommended disposal method. The Department of Environmental Quality is not aware of meat processing plants with on-site disposal pits. The department would, however, consider disposal pits on a case-by-case basis if the pits meet the requirements provided in Appendix A at the end of the paper. In 3 states, Kansas, Nebraska, and Utah, meat processors may bury mortality waste on-site after obtaining approval and necessary permits from state agencies. Montana requires the disposal of waste at permitted landfills, but provides an exemption authorizing meat processors operating within a ranch to bury their own animals. The exemption, however, does not apply if a meat processor receives animals from a third entity. The specifics of the exemption are available on page 3 of the memo. In Colorado, meat processors may bury on-site after submitting documentation and receiving approval from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Colorado statutes provide that a person may dispose of waste on his property if the solid waste disposal site complies with the Solid and Hazardous Waste Commission rules and does not constitute a public nuisance. In South Dakota, a meat processor may dispose of waste at permitted waste management facilities or on-site. If a meat processor elects to bury on-site, that meat processor is subject to the Animal Industry Board regulation. The burial requirements provided by the board are available on page 5. And with that, I'll stand for any questions the committee may have.
Questions from the committee? I have one. Were there any, based on your research, we didn't find any of the states that are completely unregulated when it comes to the disposal of animal remains?
Chairman Craigo, no, I did not find any state that were completely unregulated.
For summary purposes, what was the least amount of regulation in the states that you surveyed?
I would, Chairman Craigo, I would venture that South Dakota might be the state with the least restrictions. But I would defer to Susan Ingalls if she agrees with that statement.
Before we move to the administrator, any other questions for Pierre? All right. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Suzanne Ingalls. I'm the administrator of the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division at DEQ. I guess I'll start with the agency also did the same research that LSO did, and good news, we came to the same conclusion. I thought that was a success. I will point out, I did not contact Idaho and Kansas. We contacted all the other same states. And to get to your question, Mr. Chairman, I would agree with LSO's assessment that South Dakota is probably the least has the least regulatory oversight or standards that a meat processor would have to meet to dispose of waste on site. Sorry, no pun intended. Simply because they set standards. I'm not sure if it's in guidance or regulation, but there's no follow-up from that meat processor of documentation that they have met those standards. But the board does go out and do inspections, and then if there are issues, work with the processor at that time.
Do you have some other comments that you're ready to give to the committee, if you don't mind?
Yes, that would be great.
Thank you.
I'd like to start my discussion with you today by saying that the agency understands that the disposal of carcasses on site at meat processors is a concern, and that there should be an economical way to do that, along with being protective of public health and the environment, which is our mission. And so I'm here today to talk about how that might be able to happen and what we evaluated since the last committee meeting in June. And we learned a lot from doing our research with the other states on how they regulate it. As it was pointed out, there's a broad spectrum. It's simply not allowed, to extensive permitting. And somewhere in the middle, there's consistencies and differences amongst all of the states. But I think the key takeaway is that there's some regulatory framework with most states. And so after doing our research, we evaluated how could this occur and what are the existing options? So we looked at exemptions. Could we do a complete outright exemption, and what exemptions are in place right now? Line disposal areas, unlined disposal areas, and then a last option of something tailored and specific to carcass disposal areas at meat processing facilities. And just to tie this all back together, our concern at the agency is when disposal occurs, that there is the potential for contaminants to pollute groundwater, which is the source of drinking water for a lot of members of Wyoming. Groundwater is a source of drinking water. So that's our concern with disposal areas. And so just to also remind the committee that meat processing facilities still have some traditional waste management options beyond on-site disposal, disposing it at a landfill, a transfer station, or composting. But I'll focus on the on-site disposal today. So the first option that we evaluated is specific to exemptions. There was some discussion earlier today of, am I exempt from this on my own personal farm or ranch? And that is true. That's existing in statute, where if you have a carcass, you can dispose of that carcass on your own personal farm or ranch if it's generated on site. Now, that exemption does not apply to a commercial business. It does not go similar to Montana, where it does not extend to the meat processor where they are processing animals from third parties. And so I think that's the key difference with the exemption in our Wyoming statute. The next item that we looked at are line disposal areas. Now the agency realizes this is not really an economical option for meat processors. The cost is expensive. And not surprisingly, we haven't had any processors inquire about this option. So that's also telling to the agency. The next option that we looked into that is existing in statute is for an unlined disposal area. this takes some work on the meat processors end, where they have to evaluate site-specific conditions of the soil and evaluate depth to groundwater and do some groundwater modeling. So it's really a two-step process to do some site characterization and then do that modeling to see if that site is geologically secure and would prevent pollutants from migrating to the groundwater. We also haven't had a processor approach us about this option. I imagine that there might be some hurdles with the modeling aspect. So I'll leave that. That's an existing option in statute and in rule for meat processors right now. The last option that we evaluated was another carve out or something specific for on-site disposal at meat processors, where if we could streamline the process a little bit more, where we would establish what those site conditions would need to be to ensure groundwater is protected and that we're protective of public health and the environment, what those conditions would look like for meat processors to dispose on site, limiting their waste disposal to carcasses. I think we have that flexibility in statute and with our primacy package with EPA. So I think if the committee has a desire to propose statutory changes, it could be something simple that directs the DEQ director to propose rules and have the Environmental Quality Council promulgate those rules specific to on-site disposal of carcasses at meat processing facilities. And then the agency would, with that directive and statute, the agency would engage with impacted parties, specifically the meat processors and the slaughterhouses themselves, see what their needs are, as well as other associations and agencies like the Meat Processors Association, the NRCS, county commissioners, Department of Ag, Game and Fish, and see how we can craft a rule and standards that would allow for on-site disposal. Thank you.
Questions from the committee? Co-chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, take another stab at this one. It and that's becomes increasingly hard for me to understand why we can't get something solid so everybody knows exactly what our parameters are rather than promulgating rules. And I think sometimes that's when we get into trouble, is when we promulgate rules. So my question to you would be, after framing it like that, is there anything a little bit more substantial that we could put in a framework so that we knew exactly the product we were going to be looking at, as far as, rather than we're just going to go out and work with all these people and come back with an idea? So do you have anything more, solid than that idea?
Administrator.
Chairman, Senator, yes, I think there's some key aspects for what that framework looks like. For instance, the type of soils. Is it some things that you would want to know is if you have all sand or gravel, or what does that look like? Because an all sand or gravel soil composition would not be ideal for an on-site disposal area. I think trying to establish what is a good depth to groundwater separation distance that's common in all the other states. Some other setback location standards, for instance, to drinking water wells, residences, roads. Some other states had requirements for daily cover to prevent odor and vector issues. some of those consistent items to look at in rule.
Okay,
Sorry, one more thing to add, Mr. Chairman. Some of those basic citing criteria, so that they have a standard to meet.
Follow up.
follow up. So are you talking a little bit like what South Dakota's doing? And I mean, they have, 1,000 feet away from your surface water, just kind of a framework like that is what you would be proposing that we put in statute, and then you would go out and promulgate rules from that framework.
Administrator.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I think statutory language could be even more simple than having those specific requirements like you're referencing to South Dakota. I think those requirements would be developed during the making. And I think a statutory language could be at a higher level, directing the agency to establish the criteria or essentially the performance standard that an on-site disposal area would need to meet.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So adopting South Dakota's policy instead of, frankly, I'm a little bit suspect of department rules that are crafted later on. They don't seem to always come out to be the way they were originally talked about. Okay, they become your rules. So I guess I don't have a lot of trust in that process. I'd rather have a process where we're straightforward and you come up with some sort of agreed to language that you think you can live with, that's appropriate, that protects the things you have to protect. And then someone else makes that decision. I haven't been around a long time. I've been around long enough to see that things happen that are differently than have been spoke about. So when it comes to, South Dakota, what is wrong? Do you have any opinion about the downfalls of South Dakota's, their regulations and how they deal with this? That'd be my first question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Administrator.
Chairman, Senator, one of the drawbacks to South Dakota's is they do not identify soil types. So that would be a concern for the agency, something additional. The other item that I did not strictly compare state to state were the setback differences. Some states identify distances to drinking water wells at 200 feet. Others say 2,000 feet. I'm not sure why, but there's that difference.
Follow up, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and on the water wells, I guess maybe you could help me out with this. I thought there was to be sanitary sealed to the top, so there's no migration into said water well or with the sealing system that protects the wells from any surface contamination, number one. Number two, why couldn't you line said areas, put a liner underneath it? They do it for a lot of things that protect groundwater, for instance, underneath the soils. Why couldn't there be a liner that you would allow without having extensive testing for, this all gets into a lot of expense. And to circle back on what you spoke about earlier, you have a bunch of choices that people never use. Well, it's obvious those choices are, too onerous. So we got to come up with better choices. So is there a methodology that you come up with that would help the people trying to do these operations where they would, like a liner? I don't know. I'm not in your position. I'm just asking an open-ended question. What is your opinion about economical mitigation to this problem?
Administrator.
Mr. Chairman and Senator, installing a liner is an option currently. We could look into that further to see if there's flexibility with the liner design for a smaller disposal area.
Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I think you stated South Dakota, you were a bit concerned that they didn't considers soil type. Are you aware of any problems in the last, whatever, since they implemented their strategy? Any problems of water or wells or aquifers or anything? Are you aware of any issues there in South Dakota?
Administrator.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, no, no, I'm not aware of any issues. I haven't asked them if they are either.
Any additional questions? Representative Davis.
This sounds a little far-fetched, Mr. Chairman, but this last winter, we had an epic winter. You know, and on one side of our ranch, there was carcasses 4 deep, you know, with snow and dying and there was no effect to the ground. There's been no effect to our water wells or anything on the place. So I'm wondering, what type of science are you using and to come up with these assumptions that you're coming up with, that you want to regulate and write rules on? This would be my question. You know, Mother Nature seems to allow this to occur without apparently any reactions in our area.
Administrator.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, the disposal of waste from commercial meat processors is regulated at the national level, which is why they would then be regulated within the state, since the agency has primacy to implement the national requirements. So if there's waste that is generated on a farm or ranch at a personal level, that's not regulated.
Co-chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in South Dakota, they are regulating it as a special waste. And I didn't look up that administrative rule, but could you tell me the difference between that and how we're regulating it now, if there is one?
Administrator.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, we view, or I should say, Wyoming DEQ views the disposal of dead animals from meat processors as a type of municipal solid waste. And so it currently falls under our standard regulation for landfills, which is why we had the idea or suggestion to carve out this type of waste disposal for this business and separate that out. South Dakota, I'm not sure on their specific definitions.
Follow up, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that was one of the things we were going to investigate, is categorizing it in a different way so that we could look at other options that might provide us. So as we go forward, I think we might need to investigate that. We had talked about categorizing it as an agricultural waste. As we know, feedlots under 1,000 head are regulated differently than those above, and that the county commissioners have a role to play in that. Is there any stair step type of a measure regarding regulating this type of waste, you know, with regards to the federal regulations that are in place now? Or is it just simply the classification as to how the state classifies this waste that is contributing to how it's being regulated?
Administrator.
Chairman, Senator, the national regulations have a very broad definition for solid waste. It captures waste at a very high level from operations, industrial and commercial operations. So this waste is captured at the federal level, which is what kicks in the state's oversight. And so if there's a desire to delegate oversight to another agency or another association, DEQ would have to update our primacy program with EPA and show that whoever we're delegating oversight to has similar requirements that meet the federal standards and ability to enforce those standards.
Any other questions from the committee? I got a couple. So on the on-site disposal area, the carve out option number 4 that we've been talking about, what kind of ongoing requirements would there be for the slaughterhouses? Are we gonna be telling them they have to do water monitoring, test wells? Or is this a one-time application? Come get a permit through this new idea, and then maybe it's just annual reporting. I mean, what exactly are the long-term administrative costs / time-consuming efforts that our packing houses and slaughter plants would have to go through? Could you give us kind of an idea of what you're thinking along those lines?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So I think some of your concerns about groundwater monitoring would go back to site-specific information, but if we can show that they meet standards that are developed to show that they are in a secure area, groundwater monitoring may not be necessary. And then for ongoing need of a permit, something that we were brainstorming and that we would seek public input on is whether or not they would need to submit a full permit application, or if this is something that they could submit a notification to us on just once and say, we have met these conditions as outlined in rule, and move forward. And then we would have that on record in the event that we have a complaint or an issue that we would need to follow up on. We could pull out the notification and say, well, we have this on record and they have attested that they meet all of the conditions, and have that documentation. So there's 2 options involved, really. We haven't really discussed annual reporting. I'm not sure really on the spot what that would look like, unless I just don't want, I wouldn't want it to be very onerous or onerous at all, to say we've completed cover, or we've filled this disposal area and we opened up a new one. If they have a plan in place up front to say, we have 5 acres and this is how we're going to develop and lay out all these disposal areas, and how many do they have per acre? What's a good number? I'm not sure. But if they have that plan in place, I think that would prevent future back and forth between a processor and the agency.
Other questions? Senator Kolb?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You had mentioned that you have to comply with certain federal regulations for these types of operations for you to have primacy. So are you aware of any lawsuit against South Dakota for how they're handling their waste disposal for the matter we're talking about on site? Question: are you aware of any legal action the federal government is taking against South Dakota for this type of interpretation of the rules? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Administrator?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, no.
I have a follow-up for that question, not necessarily regarding litigation, but do you know what the application process is in South Dakota? I mean, it seems to me that what you're proposing in this option 4 is similar to what they're doing in South Dakota. What is their application / reporting requirements over there, if any? I'm just curious about that.
Mr. Chairman, I do not believe they have a permit application process. I believe or a notification. I believe they just have to meet those standards. I'm not sure if there's any reporting or record keeping requirements. And then when South Dakota goes out and inspects, if they review those, I'm not sure. I didn't get that far into the weeds.
Thank you. Senator French?
Yes, and Administrator, are you? What's the, I don't know how to say this without sounding really stupid. When I was county commissioner, we determined our staff and whatever, that the septic system just had to be 100 feet from a water well. The neighbors in these subdivision, rural subdivisions and stuff. It was determined that all the bacteria, everything was neutralized, whatever. So is there some science that says buried animal waste is somehow way different? I mean, the enzymes, whatever in the soil won't take care of it unless it's, it's got to have whatever you said, 1,000 feet away from a well. I mean, what I know there's a difference, so I'm trying not to sound too stupid here, but that ship has sailed. Can you comment on that at all?
Administrator.
Chairman, Senator, thank you for the question. And thank you for the laugh. I am sure there's some studies out there and research available that would show what a good distance would be, or we could look at that through modeling also. I wouldn't be able to tell you today 200 feet or 100 feet is the correct number, or if it's a greater distance. So like I said, I'm not sure why the states have that variation. It might have been driven for various reasons why they established those setbacks.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you, Administrator. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you.
So we're a little ahead of schedule, and I noted, and before the lunch break, there was a reference to the university and the College of Ag. And so I think if y'all don't mind, maybe come up and give us an update. Y'all had skipped out for lunch, by the way, early when we mentioned you all. And so if y'all don't mind coming up, give us a bit of an update. In particular, I think we were a little interested in the vet lab and what's going on there. And thank you for being here, by the way.
Were you going to take public comment on that last topic?
Oh, yes. Thank you for the reminder. Go ahead. We'll take public comment because there's probably going to be people who want to comment on you, whatever you have to say as well, Dr. Crane. Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Chairman Crapo and Chair Steinmetz for allowing us this opportunity today to present to your committee. So Kelly, I know you had a couple words first before we go into some of the details.
Sure. Good afternoon. Chairman Crago and Co-Chair Steinmetz. It's great to be here. Appreciate it. Thanks for pointing out that we left for lunch early, trying to beat the crowd. Anyway, really, this is kind of unprepared, but I guess from our perspective, the first thing we want to do is just tell you how grateful we are for the support that the legislature's given to our Wyoming State Vet Lab. Those of you may recall, we got some extra money in the budget to help restore our capacity, really focused on some pathology positions, as well as trying to bring some veterinary pathologists up to market value for their salaries. So again, just genuinely appreciate that, your support of that lab that provides a really profoundly positive service to the livestock industry in Wyoming. So that's really what I want to say, is that we just appreciate the support in our vet lab. And the other thing, I think this is not an excuse, but I think it's the kind of the environment we're all in now. We're not getting these positions filled as fast as we want to. We're pushing hard. We've got a consulting firm, kind of a headhunting firm that's helping us, but it is a really tough market out there to hire people. And I think that's true across the private sector and everywhere else too. So we're pushing this as hard and as fast as we can to get our capacity restored. And I think we're on a positive trajectory and we're getting where you want to see us. And maybe Barbara will give us some specific updates of where those positions are as of today.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. By the way, this is Kelly Crane. He's our Senior Associate Dean for the College of Agriculture, Life Science, and Natural Resources. And I'm Barbara Asco. I'm the Dean of the college. And what I wanted to do is just give you a short update of where we are here with our staffing. So we have been able to successfully recruit 2 new board certified veterinary pathologists. One of these individuals is Dr. Lanny Bowers, a Casper girl who's coming home, who started the 1st of August. The second is Maria Forzan, who's coming to us from a university in New York, and she'll be starting first part of April. So part of the reason this is a little bit delayed is because of her obligations at her home institution. So we did have an unexpected departure in July of a pathologist, when we have 2 remaining positions open, but we have been able to backfill the capacity that we lost in July through the use of on-site temporary staff pathologists, and also from an individual that we have quite a bit of experience with now, a Dr. Tabaran, who works remotely, and we send him data. And then what he does is analyze these data and write reports similar to what you see now in radiology reports. So we have capacity covered in that way in the lab. We've recruited a veterinary epidemiologist, this is Dr. Raphael van der Steikel, who will be overseeing our serology section and conducting epidemiological research on brucellosis. He's going to be starting in April as well. We're continuing again to utilize temporary staff pathologists. We currently have 1 individual who's going to be on site to provide surge capacity for about 10 weeks this coming fall. We're utilizing Summit Search Solutions with 3 current searches. One is for the state veterinary lab director position, which is open. So currently Dr. Barrett Bangura is our interim director, an individual that has about 5 or 6 years experience with the vet lab and is doing an excellent job under the direction of Dr. Jonathan Fox. We're searching for a bacteriologist and a virologist. Both of these individuals have clinical service roles in the lab. Dr. Sondergroth left in July to take a position with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and Dr. Myrna Miller recently retired. So we have a search firm that's going to joint search now for those 2 positions for us, in addition to having Summit continuing with our ongoing pathology search. And as Dr. Crane mentioned, this is a national shortage we have for pathologists, whether it's for humans or whether it's for animals. But that's where we are at this point. We have also filled our Wyoming Excellence Chair. These are distinguished faculty positions that the university has set aside some funding for. And one of these individuals, a Dr. David Pascal from Florida, is going to be joining us in January or February, and his area of expertise is brucellosis. So we're looking to build up our capacity to address some very important issues that are related to needs that we have in the state of Wyoming. So with that, we're happy to take any questions.
Dean Masco, and thank you, Associate Dean Crane. Any questions for the College of Agriculture? You're getting off easy. Thank you for being here and thank you for the update. That's very helpful. And now we can take public comment. Apparently I'm still out to lunch. You may have gone early, but I'm still out there because I'm skipping steps. So,
well, again, we'd like to thank you for all the support you provided to our college and specifically to the vet lab.
So back to public comment. If anybody has any public comment regarding the College of Agriculture and or the disposal of carcasses. And then what we're going to do about that with the DEQ regs. Going once, twice. All right. We'll go on to our next topic, which is state lands. And I think we'll just start off with actually with the two bill drafts, and then we'll have the deputy director come up and maybe give us an update and kind of where things are, and then also talk about the bill drafts.
Chairman, do you have a preference on which one goes first? Do you want me to do them both?
Let's just do them both at the same time. I think these are both simple enough. We can do them, and then we'll have the deputy director address them, and then we'll take public comment and questioning along the way. So thank you.
Hi, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Anna Johnson, LSO. The first bill draft in front of you is 24 LSO 69, entitled Grace Period State Land Lease Renewals. This bill draft would allow OSLI to grant a current lessee 30 additional days past the expiration date of their existing state land lease to submit an application to renew the lease. And that would be with good cause shown and with the permission of OSLI. If OSLI denies the request, the lessee would have the right to appeal the decision to the SLIB board, and the lease would not terminate during the appeal process. And then the staff comment on page 2 indicates that the appeal process may significantly delay the letting of the lease, but that the lease will not terminate during that time period. The second bill in front of you is entitled 24 LSO 70 State Land Lease Amendments. And this bill draft states that all state land lease renewal applications and rental payments that are submitted using a mail service shall be deemed filed on the date of the postmark stamped on the envelope in which the renewal application or rental payment is mailed. And this bill draft also allows for payments to be submitted through electronic payment. And then this bill draft would be effective July 1st, 2024. And I would stand for any questions on either of these bills.
Any questions for LSO? Senator French.
Thank you for your comments there. On line 3 on page 2, it says the office may grant a current lessee 30 additional days. That's up to somebody's discretion. Should that say shall grant? You know, because above that on line 2, for good cause shown, and at the written request of the current lessee, the office, you know, so they're showing good cause. Should that be, they shall be granted an additional 30 days versus may, because may might happen, may not.
So Senator, that's probably going to be a policy choice for us to make, but I'll let the good attorney from LSO answer if she has one.
Mr. Chairman, Senator French, I was just about to say that's up to the discretion of the committee.
Any other questions for LSO? If not, we'll get the deputy director up here and he can chat with us a bit about both the bills and anything else that he'd like to update us on at ongoings at state lands. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jason Crowder. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of State Lands and Investments. I've got some prepared remarks considering the two proposed bills, and I'm happy to go through and then can answer any questions that the committee has. So if you don't mind, we'll start with the bills. What I did at launch was give the committee a handout, which is the timeline for the existing lease renewal process. This, I hope, is somewhat familiar to the committee. It's the same timeline that we've looked over several times as we work through this topic and instituting a new process. I've updated it since the work that the legislature did in the last session. Obviously, the legislature passed House Enrolled Act number 83, which was House Bill 22, which gave a cure process for lessees who missed certain deadlines through the lease renewal process that was prescribed in existing statute then. What this timeline gives you is what House Enrolled Act 83 did to change that previous process. And I'll just highlight a couple areas and then we'll apply them to what the existing draft bill states. Everything in orange is what the House bill or House Enrolled Act 83 changed. So essentially it didn't change when the lease renewal process starts, which is 120 days prior to expiration, but it did change when the due date for that lease renewal application is due. And that moved it from 30 days prior to expiration to 60 days prior to expiration. And you can see that highlighted in the orange there. What it also did was insert the cure process that we talked a lot about during the last session, which is if the application is due 60 days prior to expiration of the lease. But if we don't receive one, there's a grace period now inserted in statute up to 30 days, where in that time period, we have 20 days to notify those lessees who either have missing applications or deficient applications for any reason to respond and give us that application or fix any problems that they have within it. That's up to 40 days prior to expiration. And then they have 30 days after that to respond to our notice. This becomes a very complicated and somewhat hard to manage process, only in that this is very clean in the time frame that I've given you on this spreadsheet. But we have holidays and we have weekends and we have differing times when certain applications can come in. So what I wanted to provide the committee was, in a very clean sense, this is how it looks. But in reality, we may be able to respond to a lessee shorter than 20 days. It may be and the legislature was kind enough to give us the ability to make a phone call or an email to try to expedite that process and get those applications rolling a little bit faster. So what I've inserted at the top of the timeframes here is when this office or our office will reach out to a lessee who has a problem with their application. Obviously, 120 days prior to expiration, we are required by statute to give that application to each lessee whose lease is renewing. And inside that packet is the renewing application, along with a cover letter that talks about how to fill it out, when to fill it out, when the specific deadlines are, and important aspects to pay attention to, such as weed and pest management and subleasing and how to identify that and notify the office of it. But that all comes 120 days. So that's our first reach out to the lessee to let them know that they need to start this process. As House Enrolled Act 83 implemented, if we don't receive an application 60 days prior to lease expiration, at that point, we're going to start making phone calls or sending emails or using anything that we have available to us short of the certified notice to try to reach these lessees and let them know if they have a deficient application or if they just simply haven't made the deadline and they need to submit one. Then if we don't get a hold of them in those easy measures I'll use, then we will send out that certified letter to the address on file indicating that either we have a problem with the application or that it's missing. And then they have 30 days from there, or at the very latest 10 days prior to lease expiration, to get everything into the office so that they can renew their lease going forward. What's important to note about the draft bill as we read it and as we try to apply it to the existing process that House Enrolled Act 83 put in place, it lengthens the time frame past the expiration date of the lease. And when we recognize that situation, a couple things popped out at us. Number one would be the act of admission. Obviously, when we come and we present, we talk a lot about the Constitution and we talk a lot about the act of admission, but in this case, it's important. Section 5 of the act of admission states, and I'll quote here, said lands may, under such regulations as the legislature shall prescribe, be leased for mineral, grazing, agricultural, and other purposes, provided that the term of the agricultural and grazing lease shall not exceed 10 years. So when the draft bill talks about going past the expiration date of the lease, we feel like that could be contradictory to the act of admission in giving that lease a term longer than 10 years. The legislature also codified that idea in 36.5.102, and it says no lease shall exceed 10 years. So we have two places where we have a very defined term for the lease. And when we read the draft bill and it exceeds that term, we want to make sure we highlight that for the committee's attention. Further, we have a lot of court cases around state land. We have one specific Supreme Court case, which is Mayer versus the Board of Land Commissioners back in 1948. And it essentially stated that a lessee or an applicant cannot bind the board to a lease for a term longer than what the board has already provided to it. And I'm not an attorney, so I'm using a lot of license here to try to describe this court case. And I encourage everybody to bring it up if you're interested in it. But essentially, the board has broad discretion when it leases its land and to whom it leases its land. The legislature has given a preferred right to renew that lease. Now, it's not an absolute right. It's if everything is lined up, the lessee is eligible for renewal. It doesn't bind the board to a renewal. It could decide not to renew that lease for a variety of reasons. Some of the examples that we thought were important was if the board had an idea that it needed to sell that land, that possibly it wouldn't renew the lease in that case. And we would give prior notice to the lessee that there's a sale coming, be prepared that we're not going to renew the lease. So again, it's not an absolute right to renew. The second is if we had a broader, different type of leasing scenario coming down, a very large commercial lease or something like that, we would notify the lessee that possibly that lease could not be renewed. But in any event, those examples lead to the Supreme Court decision that the board has broad discretion when renewing, that right granted to the lessee by the legislature is not an absolute right, but it needs to give the board its due consideration when it's renewing its leases. So again, when we're talking about leases that are extending past the 10 years, that is the limited term, problems arise. And we just wanted to make sure that the board is aware of, or the committee is aware of that. The second is once you exceed that term, and if there is no lease that can exceed that term, then the board needs to authorize that use by a separate leasing vehicle or permit. And typically we do that by a temporary use permit, but it's important to allow the board to do that because at that point, when the lease expires at its term, there are no terms, there are no agreements made between the board and the lessee on how that lease will be operated. So we need to make sure that there is an agreement that allows continued use, how it would be used, and then most importantly, for a revenue generating agency, how it will be compensated. So typically we move those individuals into a temporary use permit, or we simply just don't have a lease and no authorized use is available. Mr. Chairman, outside of those broad comments, we do have some very specific suggested amendments for you. If you'd like to consider them, I'm happy to run through them real fast. They're not much, but.
Great.
The first is to change the specific time period a lessee can request the office or the director to allow an extended time period or a grace period, and that to be anything that would not allow it to go past the expiration date of the lease. So we offered up on your time period, the 60 days prior to lease expiration. Again, it may not be needed because we're already reaching out to the applicants at this point, but that certainly allows it enough time, 30 days, if that's where the committee lands, to have that process move forward and it stay before the expiration date of the lease. Or separate from that, to change the 30-day grace period just down to 10 days. And that might fit a little bit cleaner inside of this process because we have a 10-day period at the end of this timeline between when the last application can be received and the expiration date of the lease. So that's a suggestion for the committee's consideration. Then on page 2, line 3, possibly replace the Office of State Lands and Investments with the director. Do the same on page 2, line 6, because that is the entity who would ultimately be making this decision to move forward with that process. And then on page 2, line 8, the State Loan and Investment Board is not the appropriate entity to approve these leases. It is the State Board of Land Commissioners. So we suggest strike State Loan and Investment Board and replace with Board of Land Commissioners. Mr. Chairman, that's all the comments that I have related to the first bill.
Any questions from the committee? Any questions from the committee on this first bill for the deputy director? All right, guess we can move on to the next one.
Mr. Chairman, that'll be very fast. We appreciate the committee's work on the second bill and don't have any comments toward it.
Questions for the deputy director on his no comments? All right, at this point, I think we'll take some public comment on both of these bills. Mr. Magagna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon with the Wyoming Stockbrokers Association. With regards to the first bill that you addressed today on the 30 days, certainly understand and respect the comments of the Deputy Director with regards to extending a lease beyond 30 days. The value in having this provision added is simply that lessees are so accustomed to things happening on the expiration date of their lease that even with all the prior notices, we see examples of where they fail to be able to respond in a time in advance of when they normally respond. But the process that was instituted in this past session of legislature is very helpful. One thought I would have if the committee goes forward with this bill would be, rather than saying that the lease shall not terminate during the appeal process, allow the lease to terminate, but provide there that the preferred right to renew the lease shall not terminate during that 30-day process. So the lease would terminate, but the party would still have that preferred right, as is granted in current statute, for an additional 30 days to apply for a new lease. And Mr. Chairman, with regards to this bill, I did pass out the proposed amendment to it. Addresses two things. The first part of it that you'll see strike out just gets rid of a provision in the current statute that expired in June of 2014 and continues to be listed in the statute and really doesn't have any legal applicability today. The second one addresses an issue that has arisen under the current statute and the rules of the agency. If a lease is not renewed, the current lessee has and another party applies and acquires the lease, the current lessee can negotiate with that other party for the value of the improvements that are on the land. If that negotiate is unsuccessful, then the director has the authority to determine that value, which must be paid. The other option that the current lessee has is to remove those improvements if that can be done without damage to the land. And certain types of improvements can relatively easily be removed. But under the current statutory language, the improvements must be removed within a period of 120 days from the date of expiration of the lease. Given the process that's involved in taking competing bids for these leases, sometimes a second round of competitive bidding, if there are two parties with a preference right, et cetera, very often a new lessee is not determined within 120 days, so that the current lessee cannot negotiate with the new lessee because they don't yet know who that is. And if they only have 120 days to remove the improvements, they, in fact, if they put in a competing bid, may be the successful applicant to get the new lease, in which case they have removed improvements that they will immediately have to turn around and reinstall because they fit their operation. So the intent here is to, and we've seen a couple of examples of this happen in the last few years. The intent here is to give the current lessee 60 days from the date of granting of a new lease to remove those improvements or to negotiate compensation with the previous lessee. With that, Mr. Chairman, that would be all I'd have on that particular bill. If you want to take any questions now before I go on, or
I think we will. Any questions from the committee for Mr. Magagna on this particular bill? Co-Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm struggling to see where this fits into this bill. I get it that it's, if a leaf is basically abandoned, but at the same time, we're just trying to give a grace period for this. So do you think that this actually feathers into this bill nicely, or do you think it would be a standalone bill?
Mr. Chairman and Co-Chair Steinmetz, I would agree with you. It doesn't fit into the current bill as it's written. It would need to be a standalone bill. I brought it in this context in case, for the sake of not having more bills, you wanted to take the time to amend and broaden the current bill so that when you consider it to move forward, it would be more broad and include this provision. I think they could be included in a single bill, but certainly the title and the entry to the current bill and the sections in there do not just lend to this being added.
Any other questions for Mr. Magagna? Would you agree that regardless of what we do on the current bill draft in front of us, that this might be separate issue we could, and I think the co-chairman asked this, but it's something we could address separately, and is it of enough importance to do so without the current bill draft?
Mr. Chairman, I would. In fact, while we certainly support the current bill draft, I would say in terms of impact on lessees that this may be a more important issue from our perspective than what is addressed in the current bill draft.
And I think some of the stuff we did last year actually made this particular problem a little more difficult, because we've probably created some more timeline issues going forward past the date of termination based on some of the stuff we did last year. And we probably just didn't catch like we should have catch the language last year.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's true. And in hearing the deputy director discuss the flow chart that he has presented to you, and I haven't seen this latest version of it, but it almost occurred to me that perhaps with the initial renewal notice, every permittee ought to get a copy of that flow chart so they can better understand the processes that they're facing.
They may have to get a flow chart for the flow chart. There's a lot of dates and a lot of complicated moving parts on there. All right, if there's not any more questions on this particular bill draft, we'll ask you to move on to the next one, Mr. Magagna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second bill with regards to the method of payment, I think that's long been needed in today's way that we all do business, and would certainly be very strongly in supportive of the electronic payment provision. With regards to the first part of the bill, the postmark, again, very supportive of that. And then that has arisen in just the most recent case that I recall that was before the board, I believe in their last meeting. And this didn't involve, let's remind me, I'll take a quick look at this. Is that applicable? Okay, it's only applicable in rural applications. The situation that arose there, as I recall it, was a request to correct an error in a subleasing that hadn't been properly reported. And the notice arrived, as I understood it, at least within the time frame, but because it arrived on a weekend, wasn't actually in the hands of the director to be addressed until the following Monday, it was deemed that they had not met the deadline. So I think this is very important. The only question I would have, and I hadn't thought about it till just now, is whether it needs to be broader than just a renewal application and apply to, given the way the postal service is today, to any required dates for submission of documentation to the Office of State Lands.
Questions for Mr. Magagna from the committee, Senator?
Mr. Chairman, just a quick question. When you say electronic payments, I think we're on this right now. Does that mean they can pay with a credit card and then the state would be obligated to pay that 2-3% fee on top of that if they did pay with a credit card? Or are you talking about, I don't know what other electronic payments, ACH payments, Could you maybe define electronic payments a little more? Thank you. Sure.
Mr. Magagna.
Chairman said, right, that was not my choice of words, so I'm not sure what was the intended application. I certainly would think that it's intended through credit card payments, which I think are essential today. That leaves another question that's not addressed here and maybe at the discretion of the director or the board as to whether that credit card fee will be absorbed by the state or added as an additional amount onto the payment that's required. And that's a separate issue, I guess, from what's here. But I think this would, by using the term electronic payments, my sense is it would allow the opportunity to do a number of things that may make sense in the future, that maybe aren't as even needed today. For example, allow a bank-to-bank transfer, which again is increasingly used for various transactions. I believe that term is broad enough to incorporate that, but I would defer to the person who selected the term.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Magagna. Any other public comment on the two state lands bills? Deputy Director, would you mind filling us in maybe on electronic payment and what's envisioned by that or not?
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, it's a question. We did select electronic payment specifically when working with the AG's office and other agencies who allow credit card payments to come in. Those were the terms that they used or that they have within their rules and statutes. And the AG's office felt that that was broad enough to accept everything that we know today as far as coming in electronically and not within the list that's already in current statute. We have worked this effort through our systems. We have an internal database. It's called SLAMS, and it is very close to being able to accept these online payments through credit cards and ACHs and bank transfers and things like that. And in that development, we have applied the administrative fee on top of the bill to the credit card applicant. So the state doesn't pay it and the beneficiaries don't pay it, but those who are electing to take advantage of that process are paying it.
Since we have you up there, Mr. Magagna brought up the issue about other documentation that may fall under the postmark rule. Could you give us some examples of what that might be besides the lease renewals or rental payments? He referenced a sublease some sublease documentation, or I don't know if that was a sublease application, but what are some of the other things? And if we wanted to include that in the postmark rule, how could we, without listing every single one, maybe define that?
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Another good question. Nothing that we do within the grazing and agricultural leasing program besides renewal applications, conflicting lease applications, vacant land leasing applications, or rental payments has a very defined deadline of when it needs to be submitted into our office. When we're talking about sublease applications, those are supposed to be submitted to our office prior to the activity occurring. The same with assignment applications or security interest or even construction of improvements. So there's no set time period. It's based on the activity that the lessee's undertaken that would start a process such as that they need to submit the paperwork to us. It's not that they missed a deadline or anything like that. It's just they simply haven't provided us the information prior to taking the activity on.
Other questions for the Deputy Director? Co-Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just regarding the 69 bill, the grace period, state land lease renewals, it was my understanding that language had come through you a roundabout way through you, and the governor's office had looked at all of that and we're okay with the grace period. So has something changed there? Because that's kind of when we had all those issues with lessees, we had one of them that would have been taken care of through the postmark because that was the truck that broke down on the highway. We had a heart attack. We had all sorts of things go on with lessees being able to get their renewals in. And so it was requested that we look at a grace period. So could you comment further on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr.
Deputy Director.
Madam Co-Chair. That conversation's been going on for a few years now, and we appreciate being involved in it and trying to find a solution to clean up as many of these situations as possible. We feel House Enrolled Act 83 went a long ways to fixing the problem that a grace period could fix. Called it a grace period from time to time. So I feel if this is working for me. The discussion related to the result of House Bill or House Enrolled Act 83 was a combination of the two. It got termed under a cure period. But we're happy to talk more about if we need more time for lessees to meet deadlines and how to discuss that with them in a grace period. We feel as though we have one, not even finished with one operational period, if you will, for the cure period that was identified in House Enrolled Act 83. We don't know if it's working. We don't know if it's going to solve all of the problems that are coming. So I can't really provide you with a great answer of, did we hit the mark on this? We feel like this is a very good communication tool with the lessees if they miss deadlines, if they provide wrong information, and for them to have a period of time to be able to correct that. And that our office has the expectation through legislative action to have that conversation to ensure that we've documented that that conversation has been had.
Chairman. So back to Mr. McGagna's point, if we didn't say that the lease shall not terminate, if we said that the preferred right to renew shall not terminate, would that alleviate some of your concern if we were to move forward with this bill?
Deputy Director.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair. Again, I'm not an attorney and I don't want to play with larger words than I'm allowed to play with. But what I will say is the preferred right to renew is a situation that a lessee can take advantage of if it meets all the boxes required to be able to take advantage of it. So that right doesn't expire based on the expiration date of the lease. If we are in a contested case situation and the Office of Administrative Hearings is reviewing a lease renewal process that has a conflicting bid placed upon it, obviously they're still trying to exercise that right. And they may ultimately be afforded that right through the expiration date of the lease simply because we can't get it out of OAH and in front of the board for final recommendation. I'm not sure.
Hang on just a second.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess we have no more comments from this side of the table. Just good. But my final statement was, Madam Co-Chair, I'm not sure if it actually does clean it up because that's still a process that's underway, and that right, as long as they check the boxes for as much as it is, continues to be in play.
Well, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you.
Representative Slagle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One question I would have for you, Director Crowder, is you said basically can't have a lease over 10 years. And so technically that lease does expire when the deal terminates. But I would see having a 30-day grace period to get the lease renewed just means you have 30 days without a lease there. And so technically that person wouldn't be necessarily using that land during that time. And so I guess I don't know. I don't see the problem that you're bringing forward is, you know, that's because technically there is no lease until they get that renewed. So you have it. It wouldn't be an extension of the 10 years. I don't think.
Deputy Director. Put on your non-lawyer lawyer hat.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I didn't bring that one with me. I apologize. I don't know if I have a response for you, Representative, for that. It is certainly something to take into consideration by the committee and that we can help support you in that deliberation.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Deputy Director. Thanks for being here today. Committee, what is your pleasure on the two state land bills? And I don't think it matters which one we look at first, but
I'd move 70.
and Steinmetz has moved 24 LSO 0070. Do we have a second? Seconded by Senator Larson. Discussion. Representative Davis.
Mr. Chair, I think in there, when we're looking at the electronic payment, we need to expand that to also include them fees that are represented explicitly, you know, that if you're going to use an electronic payment, it also is accompanied by a fee for that use of that. So it's perfectly clear to whoever's going to use the electronic payment.
Is that a proposed amendment?
You got it.
All right. Is there a second on that?
Second.
Was that Senator Ide? Okay, so we have a motion and a second on adding, not sure what the exact language will be, but including the applicable fees associated with the electronic payment. Hopefully LSO got that. Is there any discussion on that amendment? All right, seeing none, all in favor of the amendment, please say aye. Opposed? I guess we're gonna have to do a hand raise division up here for me because I can't tell. All in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. All opposed? Did you get a count over there, Katie?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Ask for those who are ambivalent.
That's right. You don't get to have a choice, Senator. All right, we'll do this one more time. I apologize, everybody. All those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. All those opposed? That amendment passes. Okay, we're back on the bill. Any more discussion on the bill? Senator Ide.
Yeah, I couldn't leave the table here today without mentioning another second amendment to this. And I'd like to propose that we put specie legal tender, gold and silver as acceptance of payment in their grazing fees. Thank you.
Do we have a second? All right, Representative Allenman seconds that. All those is there any discussion on the amendment? All right, all those in favor of the amendment, please say aye. All those opposed, please say no. No. All right, we're gonna do the hand raising again. All those in favor of the amendment, please say aye, or please raise your hand. All those opposed, please raise your hand. So that amendment has passed. All right, back on the bill. Any more discussion on the bill? All right. Seeing as this is a bill sponsorship motion, roll call is required. Katie.
Chairman, this is roll call for 24 LSO 0070 state land lease amendments as amended. Senator French.
Aye.
Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Ide.
Aye.
Senator Cole.
No.
Senator Larson. Representative Allemand.
Aye.
Representative Allred.
Aye.
Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Conrad.
No.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Representative Eklund.
Excused.
Representative Slagle.
Aye.
Representative Winter.
Aye.
Co-chairman Steinmetz.
Aye.
Co-chairman Crago.
No. I think we'll have to decide that at a later time, Senator Hicks.
Passes in both houses.
So next up is 24 LSO 0069 is, what's the committee's pleasure on that particular bill? Representative Davis.
I'd make a motion to go forth with LSO 0069 with the caveat that we change may on page 2, line 3 to shall.
We have a motion by Representative Davis. It was seconded down here first by Senator French. Do we have any discussion on the bill? And we'll address the amendment that was made at the same time, but let's get that out of the way first. So there's a proposed amendment to change the word may on line 3 to shall. And that was seconded at the same time. So is there any discussion on that? All right, seeing none, all in favor of that particular amendment, please say aye. Aye. All opposed? That amendment passes. Are there any other amendments to the bill? Co-chairman Steinmetz.
Mr. Chairman, if we're going to do that, then they can't deny the request. So I would say that on page 2, line 6, after lease, we strike the rest of the bill. So it would say if the office denies the request, so 6 through 9 after lease, that would be deleted. And then on line 3, where it says office, I would change office to director.
Is there a second for that motion? Representative Slagle seconds that proposed amendment. Is there any discussion? All right. Seeing none, all in favor of the amendment, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, that amendment has passed as well. We are back on the bill. Is there any further discussion on the bill itself? I guess my only question is if we do get into a problem with the act of admission by taking all that language out, I'm not sure. I know we don't, if we only limit it to the language regarding, as Mr. Magagna suggested, if we were only to limit it to the right to renew. I'm not sure. It's just something to think about, I guess, but if we're extending the lease past the 10-year period and we're continuing, the producers, the lessees continuing to use the land past the 10-year period, I could see us getting into an issue there. Whereas if we're just limiting it to the right to renew, and there is a grace period in there where they can be appealing this, but not necessarily occupying the land. I think that's a safer bet for us if we were ever to get challenged on the statute looking down. It would end up with the same result. But it probably would not put our bill in as much legal peril as to do it, to take out the language regarding that Mr. McGagnon had suggested, which is to limit it just to the right to renew, not to the lease itself. Because if we take that language out, we're sort of left in limbo. Then the bill doesn't really say whether the lease terminates or doesn't terminate. And I don't know where that leaves us. But just something to think about. Senator Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be a no vote on this proposal. I think passing what we just did pass, I would like us to go through a couple processes on this, renewals, and see if we do have an issue. So I'm going to be a no.
Anybody else? All right. Katie, would you please call the roll on 24 LSO 0069? Hold on. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to interrupt. Could you just go over that one more time, exactly what it is we're voting on right now? Just a brief recap.
Absolutely. So as amended, we are voting on lines 2 through the word lease on line 6. Everything else has been stricken from the bill draft, and the word office has been replaced with the word director on line 3. That's the current bill draft language. And thank you. And may has shall. Sure.
On line 3 has been replaced with director.
I'll read it out for you, Representative.
Please.
For good cause shown, and at the written request of the current lessee, comma, the director shall grant a current lessee 30 additional days past the expiration date of their existing lease to submit an application to renew the lease, period. Any more questions before we vote? Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too have concerns about too many changes being made too quickly and not knowing what the outcome is. I think we're already dealing with the aftermath of the last set of changes. And I think there's just too many coming too quickly. And I think we need to know what is going to happen with the changes we had made. So I'm going to be a no vote on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, everybody good? Ms. Talbot.
Chairman, roll call for 24 LSO 0069, grace period state land lease renewals as amended. Senator French.
Aye.
Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Ide.
Aye.
Senator Kolb.
No.
Senator Larson.
No.
Representative Allemand.
Aye.
Representative Allred.
Aye.
Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Conrad.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Representative Eklund.
Excused.
Representative Slagle.
Aye.
Representative Winter.
Aye.
Co-chairman Steinmetz.
Aye.
Co-chairman Crago.
Aye.
Majority of both houses.
That bill has passed. All right. That completes our agenda, at least our written agenda. I would welcome anybody up. If there's any public comment that's not on the agenda, we're here. We're happy to hear from folks if anybody has anything. If there's anybody on Zoom that wants to make any public comment, happy to hear that as well. Or if there's any closing comments from any of us. All righty. Yes. Co-chairman.
All right, good job, Mr. Co-Chairman. You've done a great job today. Thank you so much. And tomorrow will be our joint meeting with the Select Water Committee, and then we'll have a tour afterwards. So we're trying to provide time for you to go and change clothes and just, get into your casual attire and not have to wear your legislative clothes out to the tour. So we're looking forward to that day and another fun day with the Ag and Select Water Committee.
And we did finish ahead of schedule today.
Bravo.
Yeah. All right. With that, the meeting's adjourned.
Oh, tomorrow we're wearing the same suit.